When Emma Callahan opened the sealed hatch of her late father's rusted oil tanker, she expected the smell of fuel and decay. What she found instead was a secret that would rewrite her family's history and put her in the crosshairs of men who'd kill to bury it again. Before we dive in, take a second and drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from, subscribe, and don't forget to hit that button, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. The letter came on a Tuesday, the kind of day that already felt too heavy for its own weight. Emma Callahan was running late again, her hands still smelling faintly of bleach and diesel from the morning shift at the marina. The air outside the apartment was damp with Gulf humidity, that endless Louisiana mix of salt and heat that made everything feel just a little harder than it should. She found the envelope wedged between a stack of unpaid bills and grocery coupons, cream-colored, thick, too formal for her world of plastic and paper. Her name was typed cleanly across the front. No return address, just the faint embossed crest of a law firm she'd never heard of. Whitmore and Grant, attorneys at law. She almost tossed it into the later pile, which was really just the pile of things she never wanted to face. But something about the weight of it stopped her. Heavy, deliberate, not junk. She tore it open with the edge of her nail, expecting disappointment, another collection notice, maybe another reminder that surviving on tips and overtime wasn't the same as living. But when she unfolded the letter and saw the words, "Estate of Thomas Callahan," her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. Her father, the man who had taught her how to fix an engine before she could legally drive one. The man who had walked out when she was 17 with a half-smoked cigarette and a promise to make things right someday. The man who had never returned, not even for her mother's funeral. The letter was short, businesslike. He was dead. Heart failure in a Houston hospice. There was no funeral to attend, no ashes to scatter. Those had already been handled. What remained was the matter of his estate, which, according to the attorney's note, consisted of a single item, ownership of a decommissioned 1970s oil tanker named the Mirabelle, currently docked in Galveston. Emma laughed, a small, bitter sound that startled even her. Of course. Of course that was what he left behind, a rusted ghost ship from another era, probably rotting in some forgotten corner of the Gulf. It was exactly the kind of poetic nonsense he'd have thought meaningful. Her father, the dreamer, always chasing storms instead of shelter. Theo, her 10-year-old son, peeked over from the couch, his sketchbook balanced on his knees. "What's that, Mom?" he asked. "Just old news," she said, folding the letter, trying to sound like it didn't matter, but her fingers wouldn't let go. There was something else inside the envelope, a small brass key, tarnished green around the edges, tied with a strip of aged paper. Her name again, in his handwriting this time. She untied it carefully. Beneath the key, the note was only one sentence long. "For what I couldn't tell you. Find the truth in the dark." She stared at it until the words began to blur. It wasn't his style to write riddles. He was a man of grease and salt water, not metaphors. The phrase gnawed at her, the truth in the dark. Theo had gone back to his sketching, humming softly, lost in his own quiet world. She watched him for a moment, the curve of his jaw so much like hers, the way he drew lighthouses over and over as if they were charms against something unseen. She reached for the brass key again, rubbing it between her fingers. It was cool, almost cold, and left a faint metallic scent on her skin. "Find the truth in the dark," she whispered under her breath. Maybe it was closure, maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the simple, dangerous pull of curiosity that had always been her undoing. Whatever it was, it wouldn't let her go. By the time night fell, the letter sat unfolded on the kitchen table beside her half-eaten dinner. The world outside was quiet except for the distant hum of freight trains and the occasional bark of a dog. She tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his handwriting, that looping, confident scrawl that always made her feel both loved and abandoned. At midnight she got up, poured herself a glass of water, and walked to the window. The reflection in the glass caught the brass key glinting faintly under the kitchen light. It looked out of place there, like it belonged to another life. She thought of all the things she never said to him, the years she spent pretending she didn't care, the way she taught Theo how to skip stones, but never how to talk about loss. And then, without really deciding to, she whispered to the empty room, "All right, Dad, I'll find it." Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far off over the gulf. The air smelled of rain. It was the first time in years that Emma Callahan felt something shift inside her, not hope exactly, but the quiet tremor of something waking up, something that had been waiting in the dark. The drive to Galveston took 3 hours, but it felt longer, one of those stretches of road where time and thought blur until you forget which came first. The highway cut through marshland and mist, the air thick with that familiar Gulf scent, salt, oil, and the slow decay of forgotten things. Emma kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting lightly on the key hanging from her rearview mirror. Every so often it would swing gently, catching the sunlight like it was waiting for something to be unlocked. Theo sat in the back seat, sketching in his notebook. He was drawing ships again, this time one half sunken, its name barely visible in shaky pencil strokes, the Mirabelle. He didn't ask why they were going. He didn't need to. Kids know when the adults around them are chasing ghosts. By the time they reached the docks, the air had turned heavy and wet, fog rolling off the water in ghostly sheets. The Mirabelle was easy to spot, even from a distance. It dwarfed everything around it, hulking and skeletal, its hull streaked with rust that bled like old wounds down its sides. Seagulls perched along its railings, crying out like they were warning her away. The ship looked less like something built by human hands and more like a relic that had grown out of the sea itself, tired, corroded, and proud in its ruin. "Is that it?" Theo asked, pressing his face against the window. "That's it," Emma murmured. The words felt strange in her mouth, heavy. They parked near a chain-link fence where a hand-painted sign read, "Authorized personnel only." A small harbor office sat nearby, its paint peeling, the door propped open by a cracked boot. Inside, a man with a sunburnt face and a gray beard looked up from his desk. "You the Callahan girl?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "I suppose I am," Emma said. He whistled low. "Didn't think anyone would actually come claim that rust bucket." "Your daddy used to talk about that ship like it was family. After he disappeared, it just sat there. Costs more in dock fees than it's worth in scrap." He leaned back in his chair, squinting at her. "My advice? Sell it for parts before it sinks itself. Ain't nothing left on that tub but ghosts." Emma managed a small smile, though her stomach twisted. "Maybe I just want to see for myself." The man shrugged, handed her a clipboard, and pointed toward the docks. "Be careful where you step. That thing'll bite if you don't show respect." The metal groaned under her boots as she and Theo approached. The ship loomed higher now, its deck disappearing into a tangle of cranes and shadows. The air was colder here, the kind of chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Theo gripped her hand tighter. "You don't have to come with me," she said softly. He shook his head. "You shouldn't go alone." A part of her wanted to turn back right then, to take his hand, drive home, pretend this inheritance didn't exist, but her father's note pressed against her memory like a heartbeat. Find the truth in the dark. So she climbed the gangway, each step creaking beneath her like the ship was testing her resolve. The deck was littered with coiled rope, rusted bolts, and the faint smell of oil that seemed to seep from the steel itself. Every sound echoed, a gull's cry, the thud of a wave against the hull, the distant clang of metal from another dock. Theo wandered a few steps behind her, flashlight in hand, his small beam slicing through the gloom. Inside, the corridors were narrow and low-ceilinged, walls flaking with salt and age. The air was still, but there was a pulse to the place, as if it were remembering every man who had walked these halls before. Their footsteps echoed like whispers that never quite faded. Emma found the captain's quarters at the far end of the corridor. The door hung crooked on its hinges, a plaque barely legible. "Captain, to Callahan." Her throat tightened. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dust danced in the weak light filtering through a cracked porthole. The room smelled of rust and old paper. On the desk, beneath a film of grime, lay a leather-bound logbook. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The pages were warped with moisture, the ink blurred in places, but she recognized the handwriting instantly, his. There were dates, coordinates, mundane notes about maintenance and weather, all written in his steady hand. Then, suddenly, the entry stopped. The final page was dated 10 years ago. The handwriting was shakier this time, the lines uneven. Only one sentence filled the page. "If anyone finds this, forgive me." Emma stared at the words until they stopped looking like language and started feeling like confession. She sank into the old chair behind the desk, the wood creaking beneath her. Theo peeked over her shoulder, reading silently. "Forgive him for what?" he whispered. Emma didn't answer. She didn't know. But somewhere deep inside the Mirabelle, beneath the layers of rust and silence, she could feel something watching, something waiting. And for the first time since her father's death, she wondered if forgiveness was something she'd have to earn, not give. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it the faint groan of metal and the creak of something shifting deep within the ship's bones. Emma froze. She'd been walking the lower deck alone, tracing her flashlight over the corroded walls, when she heard it, a footstep that wasn't hers. It echoed once, then again, deliberate and heavy. Theo was still up top, sketching by the rail under the evening light, so whoever it wasn't him. Her pulse quickened. The Mirabelle was supposed to be abandoned, forgotten by everyone except ghosts and the sea. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, the beam trembling slightly as it swept across the narrow corridor. Shadows clung to every rivet, every doorway. Then a voice broke the silence. "Careful down here," it said. "Not all the stairs are kind." Emma spun around so fast the light clanged against the wall. A man stood halfway up the steps leading from the engine room, his hands raised in calm surrender. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and dark hair streaked with gray. His clothes looked lived in, an old engineer's jacket, worn jeans, boots scuffed by salt and time. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice even, quiet. "You did anyway," Emma said, forcing strength into her tone. "Who are you?" "Name's Gabriel," he said. "Gabriel Knox. I've been keeping an eye on her." He nodded toward the steel walls around them, and for a moment Emma thought he was referring to a person, not a ship. "Keeping an eye?" she repeated. "This ship belongs to me now. My father left it to me." "I know," he said simply. "Thomas told me you'd come." Her heart stopped for half a beat. "He told you?" "Before he disappeared," Gabriel said. "He said, 'One day my daughter will come. Make sure she doesn't turn away.'" The words hit harder than she expected. No one had spoken about her father's disappearance like that before, like it was a thing planned, not an accident or a death. She studied Gabriel carefully. He didn't look like a liar. But there was something about his eyes, steady, shadowed, holding back more than they gave away. "What exactly did he mean by that?" she asked. Gabriel stepped forward, his boots ringing against the metal. "Your father wasn't just keeping an old ship. He was guarding something, something people would kill for." Emma's laugh came out sharp. "That sounds like a bad movie plot. You expect me to believe that?" He shrugged. "Believe what you want. But you're standing on a secret, Miss Callahan, and whether you like it or not, it already knows your name." The way he said it, like the ship itself was listening, made her skin prickle. She crossed her arms. "What were you doing here before I showed up?" "Maintenance," he said. "The engines still work. Barely. I've been running checks, keeping it from sinking outright. He paid me in advance, said it needed to stay alive until you came." "Paid you in advance? 10 years ago?" "More like 12. His gaze drifted past her shoulder toward the dark corners of the ship. Some debts don't expire. Emma stared at him, torn between anger and something else, something uneasy, familiar. He carried himself with the same quiet certainty her father had, the same way of speaking, like the world was larger than anyone could see. "If you know something," she said finally, "you'd better start explaining." What was he hiding? What's really on this ship? Gabriel's expression didn't change, but his voice lowered. "You're not ready to know that yet. Try me." He hesitated, studying her the way a man studies a storm before deciding whether to sail into it. "Your father said you'd say that," he murmured. Then he turned toward the stairs, boots echoing as he climbed back up into the fading light. "Lock the cabin tonight," he called over his shoulder. "The sea's calm, but the past isn't." When he was gone, the air seemed heavier. Emma stood in the engine room for a long moment, listening to the rhythmic groan of the ship's hull as it shifted against the tide. The sound wasn't threatening, just alive, like breathing from something ancient and patient. That night, she tried to sleep in the captain's quarters. Theo snored softly beside her, curled in a blanket. Outside, waves lapped against the hull, soft but relentless. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Gabriel's voice. "You're standing on a secret." The phrase clung to her thoughts, winding tighter with every heartbeat. She dreamed of her father, his hands blackened with oil, his voice low, saying, "Not everything you inherit is meant to be kept." When she woke before dawn, the ship was silent again. But there was one thing she couldn't shake, the faint sound of footsteps above her, slow and deliberate, as if the stranger on deck wasn't the only one still keeping watch. The morning broke gray and heavy over Galveston, the sky hanging low like wet canvas. Emma stood on the deck of the Mirabelle, her coffee cooling fast in the breeze, watching the mist roll off the Gulf in pale ribbons. The ship groaned beneath her feet, its voice deep and weary, as though it resented being awake again after so many years of silence. Theo sat cross-legged near the railing, sketching something in his pad, probably another drawing of the ship, though lately his lines had become darker, sharper. Gabriel had said he'd meet them later to run an engine test, but Emma had other plans. The note from her father burned in her jacket pocket like a dare, find the truth in the dark. Down in the cargo hold, the air turned colder, thicker. Dust floated through beams of weak light, leaking from above, dancing like ghosts that refused to settle. The place was enormous, a cathedral of rust and forgotten oil drums, with echoing metal ribs that hummed with every shift of the tide. Emma swept her flashlight slowly over the walls, and the beam caught something unusual near the far corner, a rectangular outline, barely visible beneath layers of grime and salt crust. "Theo," she called, her voice carrying through the hollow space, "over here." He clambered down the narrow ladder, flashlight in hand. "What is it?" "I'm not sure." She crouched and ran her hand along the faint seam. The metal beneath felt different, colder, smoother, deliberate. It wasn't just another patch of rust, it was a door. Theo crouched beside her, brushing away flakes of corrosion. It looked sealed shut. "More like welded," she murmured. She traced the edge with her fingers, finding the faint outline of a latch buried under grime. Whoever had closed it hadn't wanted anyone to open it again. A clatter from above made her flinch. Gabriel's boots echoed down the ladder a moment later. "You shouldn't be in this section," he said, his tone flat but tense. "The hold's unstable. Air's bad, and there's residue from old chemicals." Emma straightened, wiping her hands on her jeans. "We're fine. I was just looking." He frowned, eyes flicking from her to the hatch. "You found it," he said quietly, almost to himself. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing worth opening." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Your father told me to seal that compartment years ago. He said it wasn't safe." Theo's flashlight beam darted toward the seam, catching a thin slit where the welding had cracked. The light spilled through, reflecting off something inside, something metallic, that shimmered faintly beneath the dust. "It's not empty," Theo whispered. Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Leave it alone." Emma felt the tension humming in the air. "If it's dangerous, Why didn't my father remove it? Because some things, Gabriel said, are safer buried. The way he said it made her uneasy. There was fear behind the calm, something too heavy to be just about rust or fumes. Before she could press further, Gabriel turned toward the ladder. Lock this section up when you're done. I'll be topside checking the generators. His voice echoed as he climbed, fading with each step until the sound of his boots was swallowed by the hum of the ship. For a while neither Emma nor Theo spoke. The hold felt even quieter now, like the ship itself was listening. "Mom," Theo said softly, "he's hiding something." Emma sighed. "Yeah, I think so." She looked at the hatch again. The welding seams glinted faintly under the flashlight. Her father's key hung warm against her chest, resting beneath her shirt. She pulled it out, turning it over in her palm. It didn't look like it belonged to any door she'd seen on the ship, but something about it, its worn teeth, its weight, felt right. "Go wait up top," she said gently. Theo hesitated. "You're going to open it, aren't you?" "I just need to see," she replied. He didn't argue. He trusted her, maybe too much. When his footsteps disappeared up the ladder, Emma crouched again and pressed the key into the small lock she'd uncovered near the seam. It fit. The metal resisted at first, then gave with a soft click that echoed through the hold. She wedged a crowbar beneath the edge, pushed, and with a groan that sounded like the ship itself waking from a bad dream, the hatch cracked open. A rush of stale air escaped, carrying the scent of iron and something faintly chemical. Emma coughed and shone her flashlight inside. Beneath layers of gray dust sat a steel container about the size of a trunk, edges sharp, the surface marked with faded Cyrillic letters she couldn't read. On one corner, a logo, a red star wrapped around an anchor, was barely visible. She didn't recognize it, but it didn't belong here. Not on an American ship, not on his ship. Her hand hovered over the container. The steel was cold, impossibly so. For a moment she thought she heard something faint beneath it, like the low hum of machinery still alive after decades of silence. She drew her hand back. Whatever her father had hidden down here, it wasn't just cargo. And from the way Gabriel's warning still echoed in her mind, she knew one thing for certain: this ship was about to start telling its story, and it wasn't going to be a quiet one. By the time Emma reached the dock the next morning, the sky had turned a sharp, merciless blue, the kind of color that made everything look too clean, too exposed. Seagulls circled lazily above the Mirabelle, but the air felt different today. The quiet hum that usually surrounded the harbor was replaced by the crunch of unfamiliar shoes on gravel and the clipped tone of voices that didn't belong. 3 men stood near the base of the gangway, their dark suits and polished shoes an almost ridiculous contrast against the rusted steel and seaweed-stained concrete. One held a leather folder. The other 2 stood slightly behind him, their eyes scanning the deck like they were expecting it to breathe. "Emma Callahan?" the man in front asked as she approached. His voice was smooth, bureaucratic, practiced. "Department of Maritime Safety. We received reports of an unregistered vessel engaging in potentially hazardous restoration activity." Emma frowned. "Hazardous?" she repeated. "It's a dead ship. I'm cleaning it up, not launching it." The man smiled thinly, flipping open his folder. "Then perhaps you can explain why it still carries restricted freight classification tags, or why our database shows encrypted manifest records for the Mirabelle dated within the last 6 months." The words barely registered at first, and when they did, they hit like a punch. Encrypted manifests? She hadn't touched any records. She hadn't even known there were any. "I think there's been some kind of mistake," she began, but her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "This ship hasn't moved in decades." One of the men behind him shifted slightly, his gaze landing on the cargo hold hatch like he already knew what was beneath it. "Ma'am," the first man said, still calm, still polite, "we're authorized to inspect the vessel. It would be best if you cooperated." Emma opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat when a familiar voice cut through the air. "Not without a warrant, you're not." Gabriel's voice carried easily across the dock, steady but sharp enough to slice through their composure. He descended from the deck like he owned it, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Morning, gentlemen. I'd ask you to mind where you're standing. Some of the bolts on that gangway are as tired as your excuses." The lead official's jaw tightened. "And you are?" "Custodian of the ship," Gabriel said smoothly. "Been under contract since 2008. You want to talk about safety? I've got a stack of maintenance logs taller than you." The man's composure cracked just slightly. "We have reason to believe this vessel is storing unregistered cargo." Gabriel didn't blink. "If it was, you'd have found it by now. Which means either your database is wrong or someone fed you bad intel. Either way, you're trespassing. I'll be happy to take your names for the report." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. The official closed his folder with a snap. "We'll be back," he said finally. "See that you don't remove anything in the meantime." "We'll keep her exactly as she's been," Gabriel said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. When they were gone, Emma finally exhaled. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. "They knew about the cargo, Gabe." "They knew something's down there?" Gabriel leaned against the railing, the morning sun catching the edges of his hair. "They always knew," he said quietly. "They've just been waiting for someone to open the door." She stared at him. "What are you talking about?" He sighed, his face lined with something older than exhaustion. "Your father wasn't just a ship captain, Emma. He ran transport for oil companies in the 80s, real heavy hitters. The kind of men who didn't exist on paper. They moved money, weapons, black market data. For years, your father looked the other way. Then one shipment came through that he couldn't ignore. Classified freight, evidence of things those men paid fortunes to bury." Her stomach dropped. "So he smuggled it?" "No," Gabriel said softly. "He stole it." Emma felt the world tilt slightly. "You're telling me that whatever's in that container, it's evidence?" He nodded. "Tapes, Dreves documents, proof of embezzlement cover-ups, environmental crimes that would have destroyed people in power. He wanted to turn it in, but before he could, he vanished. Word was, he refused to hand it over. They made an example of him. But before he disappeared, he told me one thing, that the cargo wasn't oil, and it wasn't poison. It was truth." The word landed like an anchor in her chest. Gabriel turned to her, eyes dark, unreadable. "You see now why I told you not to open that hatch?" Emma swallowed hard. "You think those men this morning were theirs?" "Not think," he said. "No." For a long moment neither spoke. The waves slapped softly against the hull, steady as breath. Emma looked out at the water, sunlight trembling across its surface. She thought of her father's note, "Find the truth in the dark," and felt its meaning shift. He hadn't been running from guilt. He'd been running from them. She tightened her grip on the railing, feeling the salt bite into her skin. "Then we finish what he started," she said. Gabriel didn't answer right away, but when he finally did, his voice was low, almost reverent. "Just remember, Emma. The deeper the truth, the colder the water." The hatch screamed as it opened, a long metallic groan that echoed through the belly of the Mirabelle like a warning the ship itself didn't want to give. Emma's flashlight flickered against the steel walls as she crouched inside the cargo hold, heart hammering, breath visible in the cold air that poured out from the open container. It was colder here, unnaturally so, as if the years had sealed something inside that refused to die. Dust swirled in the beam of her light. She half expected the air to taste like rot, but instead it was clean, sterile, mechanical, preserved. Rows of small cylindrical canisters lined the interior like soldiers waiting for orders. Each one was tagged with brittle labels and dates in fading ink, 1984, 1986, 1992. There were symbols, too, and words printed in Russian, the paint cracked with age. Emma ran her fingers over one, feeling the roughness of time. When she lifted it, she could hear something shift inside, a faint metallic rattle like loose teeth. At the back of the container, buried under a layer of plastic sheeting, lay a rusted briefcase. It was heavy, its hinges reluctant, the metal warped and scarred with salt corrosion. Emma set it down on the floor of the hold, her flashlight trembling as she unlatched the clasps. The sound of it snapping open made her flinch. Inside, everything was meticulously organized, the kind of precision that belonged to a man who spent his life hiding from chaos. There were handwritten notes in her father's unmistakable scrawl, stacks of coordinates, and several thick ledgers bound with twine. The pages were yellowed, but still legible, filled with columns of names, dates, and numbers that stretched across continents. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Then her eyes caught on the word transfer repeated again and again, followed by impossible amounts of money, hundreds of millions, sometimes billions, funneled into accounts connected to oil corporations, energy boards, and government entities she recognized from the news. Her stomach turned cold. She flipped to another page and saw the familiar handwriting again, rougher this time, like her father had written it in a hurry. "If you're reading this, Em, tell the truth, but know the truth will cost you." Her throat tightened. The letters blurred for a moment before she blinked them back into focus. Tell the truth. What truth? The kind that could bury people, or the kind that would bury her? A clang echoed from above deck, jolting her. Footsteps. Then Gabriel's voice, low but sharp. "Emma!" He appeared a moment later, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. When he saw the open container, his face went pale. "You opened it," he said, not angry, just heavy with something like sorrow. "You told me it wasn't safe," she said, still kneeling over the briefcase. "You were right, but not for the reasons you meant." Gabriel stepped closer, squinting down at the ledgers. "God," he muttered. "He kept everything. Every payment, every name. He must have copied the originals before the companies could destroy them." "Who are these people?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "The kind that don't go to prison," Gabriel said quietly. "They just change letterheads and keep buying senators." Emma looked at him, the beam of her flashlight cutting across his face. "You knew." "I suspected," he admitted. "Your father told me once that he had something big, something that could sink more than ships. But he also said he didn't trust anyone to carry it after him." She swallowed hard. "Then why me?" Gabriel looked around the hold, the dust floating like ash. "Because you're not part of their world. You don't owe anyone anything." Emma stared down at the files, her father's handwriting crawling across every page like veins of guilt and truth. Her hands shook as she picked up one of the magnetic tapes, the black reel inside still intact, fragile, yet alive. Somewhere in this mess was her father's voice, maybe even his last words before he vanished. "What happens now?" she whispered. Gabriel crouched beside her, his voice steady but quiet. "Now? Now they'll come looking. They always do when someone opens a door that was meant to stay locked." She wanted to argue, to tell him they'd just hide the evidence, burn it, bury it again. But she couldn't. The thought of destroying what her father had risked his life to preserve made her chest ache. "I can't just walk away," she said finally. "I know," Gabriel replied. "That's what scares me." They sat in silence for a while, the soft slap of waves against the hull marking time. Emma traced a trembling finger along the edge of one ledger until it caught on a corner of paper folded into the binding. She pulled it free and saw her father's handwriting again, only this time it was addressed directly to her. "They'll try to make you doubt what's right. But truth, Em, truth has a heartbeat, and once it starts, it doesn't stop." The words landed like an oath. She folded the note carefully, slipping it into her pocket. The sea groaned beneath them, deep and restless, as if even the water understood that some secrets were never meant to surface. But it was too late now. The truth was awake. The sound was sharp and wrong, a shatter that cut through the quiet night like a gunshot. Emma jerked upright from the kitchen table, heart hammering. For a second she thought it was a dream, just the echo of her father's voice still playing through the old tape deck. But when she heard Theo call from his bedroom, frightened and small, she knew it wasn't. She ran to the front window. Her truck sat under the weak glow of the street lamp, a spider web of glass spreading from a fresh wound in the driver's side. The sight hit her like cold water. No accident. Someone had been here, close enough to touch her life without ever being seen. By the time she stepped outside, barefoot on the cracked concrete, the night had gone still again. Crickets droned. A lone car rolled through the next street over, indifferent. She approached the truck slowly, her breath fogging in the cool air. The rock lay on the seat like a relic, jagged and heavy, wrapped in a strip of paper. She unfolded it with shaking fingers. Walk away from the Mirabelle. No signature, no instructions, just an order. Her stomach turned cold, but underneath the fear something darker stirred. Anger. It rose from a place she thought she'd buried a long time ago, the same place that had kept her upright after her father left, after her mother died, after every time the world told her she didn't matter. Whoever had thrown that rock thought she'd scare easy. They didn't know her at all. She found Gabriel leaning against the porch railing when she came back inside. He'd arrived earlier to help her sort the canisters, but now his posture was tight, watchful. He'd already seen the truck. "They're not subtle," he said. "No," she replied, still holding the note. "They're not." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Emma, you need to leave. Take Theo and get out. Let the ship go. This," he gestured toward the tapes stacked neatly in crates on the floor, "isn't worth your life." "It's my father's life," she said quietly, "and he's gone." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not just the caution in his eyes, but fear, not for himself, for her, for Theo. But fear was something she had lived with for years, a constant hum under the noise of survival. This was different. This was purpose. "I'm not walking away," she said, her voice steady. Gabriel exhaled, long and slow, like he'd been waiting for that answer and dreading it. "Then at least do it smart. No more open hatches, no more obvious moves. If they think you're still digging, they'll escalate." Emma nodded, but didn't promise anything. She wasn't sure she could. That night, after Theo had finally fallen asleep with his sketchbook clutched to his chest, she sat at the kitchen table again. The tapes were lined up like soldiers awaiting interrogation. She plugged an old USB converter into her laptop and slid the first one into the deck. The reels turned slowly, creaking as they woke from decades of silence. Then she heard him. Her father's voice filled the room, rough and unsteady, like gravel underwater. "If you're hearing this, Em, I'm sorry." His words cracked, then steadied. "There are things I carried I couldn't leave on paper. They're on these tapes. They'll try to bury them. They'll try to bury you." Emma's hand shook as she adjusted the volume. The sound of his voice, alive and not alive, was a punch straight to the heart. She'd forgotten how deep it was, how it used to soften when he spoke just to her. "If they find you," he said, voice fraying at the edges, "they'll call it an accident." She pressed her palm to her mouth. Every word felt like a ghost reaching across time, not warning her to run, but daring her to stand. She thought of the rock through her window, the note, the men in suits by the dock. She thought of Theo sleeping in the next room. Her father hadn't left her a ship. He'd left her a war. She hit the record button on her laptop, digitizing every word. One by one she lined up the tapes, feeding them into the machine like prayers. Outside the night stretched quiet and indifferent, but inside Emma Callahan was no longer afraid. She was awake. The first whiff of smoke came as a whisper, faint and bitter, curling up from somewhere beneath the deck like a secret. Emma caught it before she saw it, pausing mid-sentence as she spoke to Theo about homework, the acrid scent sliding down her throat. She glanced toward the cargo hold, where she'd been working all afternoon digitizing her father's tapes, and saw nothing but darkness. Still, the smell was wrong. Burnt wiring and oil, not the stale tang of rust she'd grown used to. "Do you smell that?" she asked quietly. Theo sniffed the air, nose wrinkling. "Like the toaster?" Gabriel's boots echoed on the ladder a second later. "That's not a toaster," he said, his voice low, grim. "Get him up top." "Now." Emma didn't argue. She grabbed Theo's hand, heart slamming in her chest, and moved fast, her steps clanging against the metal stairs as they ascended toward the main deck. The smoke grew thicker behind them, rising in lazy, gray fingers that curled along the walls, reaching. When she burst onto the deck, the night air hit her like a slap, cool, damp, smelling of salt. But the relief was brief. Below, on the far end of the dock, orange flickers had begun to bloom, small at first, then swelling, as if fed by something unseen. Flames leapt hungrily from a pile of discarded crates near the Mirabelle's gangway, and the black water beneath reflected them in trembling shards of light. "Stay here," she told Theo, shoving him toward the open space near the bow. "No," he cried, clutching her arm. She forced her voice steady. "I'll be right back." But Gabriel was already there, pulling Theo behind him with one arm, his other hand gripping Emma's shoulder. "We go together," he said firmly. "This isn't a drill." The flames spread fast, too fast. They licked along the dock planks, weaving toward the ship's hull. Someone had doused this place in accelerant. She could smell it now under the smoke, sharp and chemical. The Mirabelle groaned as if she understood what was coming. "Jump!" Gabriel barked. They scrambled down the gangway, coughing, the air growing hotter with each step. Theo clung to Emma's waist, his eyes wide, unblinking. Gabriel stayed behind them, steady, blocking the smoke with his body. When they hit the dock, Emma dragged Theo across the pavement until they reached the far side of a loading yard. From there they turned and looked back. Flames had begun to climb the Mirabelle's lower deck now, curling around the hull like claws. Black smoke poured upward, blotting out the stars. The ship's rusted metal glowed faintly red in places, like veins under skin. Emma's chest ached, not from the smoke, but from the sight of it. The ship her father had protected, now burning under someone else's hand. "This isn't random," she said hoarsely. "This is them." Gabriel's face was a mask of shadow and firelight. "Your father survived something like this once, he said quietly. "Off the coast of Liberia. Ship full of evidence. Fire started in the galley, but it wasn't the galley's fault. He called it an accident until the day he died." Emma stared at him. "And the people who said it?" "They never stopped looking for him," Gabriel said. "And now they're looking for you." The words landed like stones in her stomach. She turned back to the burning ship, watching smoke curl into the night like black ribbons, twisting and disappearing into the humid air. The fire department arrived minutes later, their sirens piercing the quiet, water arcing from hoses onto the flames. But she could tell even from here it was too late. The lower deck was gone, eaten by fire, the cargo hold compromised. One of the firefighters shouted something about an electrical spark, but Emma didn't even bother to respond. She could see the scorch patterns from where she stood, too clean, too deliberate, like someone had drawn a map of destruction and followed it to the letter. Theo pressed his face into her side, trembling. "Mom," he whispered, "are we in trouble?" She crouched and held him tight, her voice low but steady. "We're not the ones in trouble," she said. "They are." Gabriel looked at her then, not with pity, but with a strange flicker of respect. "It's begun," he murmured. Emma didn't take her eyes off the ship. The flames cast her reflection in the water, broken and rippling, but she didn't look away. Her father had been hunted. Now it was her turn. But unlike him, she wasn't going to run. The storage unit smelled like dust and endings, the kind of air that hadn't been moved in years, where the silence felt earned. Emma stood just inside the doorway, her flashlight cutting through the dark like a hesitant memory. The place was smaller than she expected, maybe 10 feet across, but it was packed. Wooden crates, faded photographs, boxes of old naval uniforms. Her father's handwriting was scrawled across everything, bold and slanted, as if he'd been in a hurry to preserve what time wanted to forget. Theo crouched near the front, tracing his fingers along an old shipping label. Was this all his? Emma nodded. Yeah, every bit of it. She swallowed hard. He must have rented this before he disappeared. She'd found the unit listed in a receipt tucked inside one of her father's ledgers, a detail easy to miss if she hadn't read through every margin note at 3 a.m, unable to sleep. Something in her gut told her this place would matter, and now, standing here, she could feel the weight of that instinct settling on her like humidity. She started digging. Most of it was harmless. Worn books on engineering, maritime law, even an old chessboard missing 2 pawns. But toward the back, beneath a stack of oil-stained canvas tarps, she found a small wooden chest. It was the size of a shoebox, carved with faded roses along the lid. A music box. She turned the crank carefully, but the gears stuck halfway, wheezing out a single, off-key note before it fell silent again. Theo looked up. What song was it supposed to play? She smiled faintly. He used to hum it when I was little. Something about the sea, I think. She shook it gently. Something rattled inside. Not the normal rattle of gears, but heavier, sharper. Emma set the flashlight down and flipped the box over. Tiny screws held a brass plate in place. Her fingers worked at them until one gave way, then another, until the plate lifted and revealed a hollow beneath the mechanics. Inside was a small brass key, tarnished but perfectly shaped. A tag dangled from it, brittle with age. The handwriting was unmistakable. Engine room. She stared at it for a long moment, the hum of blood in her ears louder than the quiet around her. Then she slipped it into her jacket pocket. Back aboard the Mirabelle, the dock still smelled faintly of smoke, but the air was calm. The fire department had left hours ago, calling the damage contained, but she knew better. Someone had wanted her to stop digging. That meant she was close. Gabriel had gone to check the generator, leaving her alone in the lower deck. The shadows flickered with the dull light of her lantern as she crouched behind the old boiler. The metal there looked newer than the rest, cleaner welds, straighter seams. Her father's handiwork, no doubt. She ran her palm across the wall until she found a small indentation, almost invisible. A keyhole. Her heart jumped. The key fit perfectly. She turned it, the old lock clicking open with a satisfying finality. The panel shifted slightly, revealing a hollow compartment behind it, a vault built into the bones of the ship. When she pulled it open, she froze. Inside, stacked neatly in rows, were gold bars, dozens of them stamped and numbered, their edges glowing dull amber under the lantern light. Mixed among them were sealed envelopes, old, yellowed, each one marked in her father's handwriting. For you and Theo. Do not sell. Do not trust anyone who asks where it came from. Emma sank down onto the floor, her knees weak. Her breath came slow, shallow. This wasn't just inheritance. This was intentional, measured. He'd hidden this not as treasure, but as leverage. Theo's voice drifted from above deck. Mom, you okay? She forced her voice steady. Yeah, sweetheart. Just found something of Grandpa's. She brushed her thumb over one of the envelopes, her name written with that same looping care he'd always used. Beneath the paper, she could feel the faint outline of another note. She didn't open it. Not yet. The weight of what surrounded her was enough to understand the truth. Her father hadn't vanished because he was running from danger. He'd vanished because he was guarding it. The gold, the data, the recordings. It wasn't about greed. It was about power, the kind that toppled men and silenced witnesses. Emma stood slowly, the flickering light casting her shadow across the gleaming bars. $90 million, maybe more. Enough to buy a kingdom or burn one down. She closed the vault and turned the key until the latch clicked shut again. The sound echoed through the hollow corridors of the ship like a promise. This time, she thought, they weren't going to take anything from her. Not the ship. Not the truth. Not the life her father had died to protect. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and rain-soaked pavement, the kind of place where secrets were exchanged for the price of a cup. Emma sat in the corner booth, fingers wrapped tightly around her mug, eyes on the window. The sky outside was the color of pewter, heavy with another storm. Thea was at school, under Gabriel's watch, safe for now. But the air still felt charged, as if the world was holding its breath. She didn't know what she expected from this meeting. Maybe answers, maybe a warning. The bell above the door chimed and Sarah Dunn walked in. The woman looked older than the photos Emma had found. Hair streaked silver, trench coat damp at the edges, but her eyes were sharp, the kind that had once cut through government lies and corporate smokescreens for the evening news. She spotted Emma immediately, crossed the floor without hurry, and slid into the opposite seat. "You've got your father's stubborn look," she said by way of greeting. Her voice was low, roughened by cigarettes and years of disillusionment. Emma blinked. "You knew him?" Sarah nodded. Well enough to know he scared the hell out of powerful men. She stirred her coffee without drinking it. "I covered his case in '95. Back then he was the anonymous source no one could prove existed. Then he vanished, and suddenly every story I'd written about offshore laundering and oil bribery got buried under red tape and polite threats. And now his daughter calls me out of the blue." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You found something, didn't you?" Emma hesitated, then reached into her bag and slid a few photocopied pages across the table. The ledgers, the coordinates, a few of her father's handwritten notes. Sarah didn't touch them right away. She studied Emma's face instead. "Do you have any idea what this is?" "Not exactly," Emma said. "But I know people have already tried to kill me for it." That made Sarah move. She pulled a pair of reading glasses from her coat pocket and leaned over the documents. The clatter of dishes and low hum of conversation faded as she scanned the numbers. "These accounts, these are shell companies. Old ones, defunct on paper, but they're still funneling money. See this one?" She tapped a name at the top of the page. Black Tide Holdings. They financed half the private oil operations in West Africa in the late '80s. You connect that to these coordinates. She scribbled on a napkin. "And you've got one of the biggest environmental bribery trails in modern history." Emma frowned. "I don't understand. Why would my father have all this?" Sarah leaned back, eyes thoughtful. "Because he wasn't just transporting oil, sweetheart. He was transporting evidence. These executives used tankers like the Mirabelle to move cash, data, and raw materials, off the books, untaxed, untraceable. Your father must have stumbled onto something massive." Emma's heart thudded. "And the gold?" Sarah's expression darkened. "That wasn't payment. That was ransom." The word hung in the air between them. "What do you mean?" Sarah took a long sip of her coffee before answering. "When he refused to stay quiet, they paid him off. A golden leash. It wasn't supposed to be a reward, it was a warning. They wanted him to disappear, and he did, but not the way they thought. He took their money, buried it, and planned to use it to destroy them later. He wasn't running, Emma. He was waiting for someone to finish what he started." Emma stared down at the pages, her father's handwriting looping across the margins like veins of truth. She thought of his voice on the tapes, weary but still fighting. "He planned all of this," she murmured. Sarah nodded slowly. "He didn't trust the system, couldn't. Every man he turned to was either bought or buried, so he hid everything, evidence, gold, data, until someone with his blood would find it." She reached out, her hand rough and sure. "You're walking into a war zone, Emma. These people don't just cover tracks, they erase families." Emma met her gaze. "Then I guess they'll have to work harder this time." Sarah studied her a moment longer, then smiled faintly. "You really are his daughter." Rain began to fall, tapping softly against the diner windows. Outside, the world looked blurred and small. Inside, under the hum of flickering lights, a plan began to take shape, not of survival, but of revelation. When they left, Sarah handed Emma a small flash drive. Start digitizing everything you can, she said. We'll build a map, name by name, account by account. But be smart. If they smell blood, they'll come fast. Emma tucked the drive into her pocket. The air outside was colder now, the rain sharp against her face, but for the first time, she didn't feel lost. Her father hadn't died running from the truth. He'd died protecting it, and she wasn't going to let it stay buried any longer. The day started almost normal. A thin strip of sun had cut through the clouds, and for the first time in weeks, the air at the dock didn't feel like a threat but like a pause. Emma had driven Theo to school herself, hoping routine would keep the walls from closing in. She spent the morning at the ship with Gabriel, scanning ledgers, transferring files to a flash drive, piecing together more of the story with Sarah's help over encrypted calls. For a heartbeat, she believed they were getting ahead of it. The text came just after noon. She'd been kneeling in the captain's quarters, boxing up tapes for Sarah to take, when her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it. Spam, she thought, or another warning from an unknown number, but the preview froze her blood. Return the cargo or lose him. The mug of coffee slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. She didn't even feel it. Her fingers moved on their own, opening the message. There was no number, no signature, just those 6 words. "Emma?" Gabriel's voice came from the doorway. She turned the screen toward him, her hands shaking. "They have Theo." His face went still. He didn't reach for her, didn't speak right away, just closed the door and drew the blinds like he'd done this before. "When did you last see him?" "This morning. School," her voice cracked. "He never came home?" "No." She tried calling Theo's phone, straight to voicemail, again and again. Each time the automated message felt like a fist closing around her throat. Gabriel crouched beside her. "This isn't a bluff," he said softly. "They wouldn't risk the text if they didn't already have him." She wanted to scream, but the noise caught in her chest. "Who?" she rasped. "The men from the docks. Or someone who bought their loyalty. Could be government, could be private contractors, could be both." "I don't care who," she said. "I just want my son back." He nodded slowly, but there was something behind his eyes, an old, familiar dread. If they're serious, they'll give instructions. They'll want to control the timeline. Until then, we don't panic. We move. But Emma was already moving. She tore through every box, every drawer, searching for any clue she'd missed. She called the school, the neighbor, even the gas station clerk near the marina. Nothing. Theo had been there at drop-off. No one remembered seeing him after lunch. Her hands were raw from gripping the edge of the desk when she finally stopped. Her father's voice from the tapes slid into her mind like a blade. "If they find you, they'll call it an accident." Not an accident. She ran out to the parking lot, dropped to her knees under the truck, and began feeling along the undercarriage with desperate, shaking fingers. On her third sweep, she found it, something smooth and foreign tucked near the axle. A black disc, no bigger than a matchbox, blinking faintly red. She yanked it free. "Tracker," she said, her voice hoarse. Gabriel was right behind her. He took the device, his jaw tightening. "They've known everywhere you've gone for weeks," he muttered. Emma stood, wiping her hands on her jeans. Her panic had burned into something colder, harder. "They think I'm going to hand everything back. They think I'm going to trade my father's proof for my son." Gabriel hesitated. "Aren't you?" "No." Her voice was flat, unrecognizable. "I'm going to find them before they even know I'm coming." He looked at her then, and for the first time he seemed almost afraid of her. "That's not who you are." "It is now." She drove the truck back to the ship, her mind running faster than the road. Every plate number she'd seen near the dock, every unfamiliar face at the diner, every black SUV parked too long across from the school. She scribbled them on a pad, her handwriting jagged, furious. The ship loomed out of the mist as she pulled up. Her father's words echoed again, but this time she didn't hear warning. She heard a dare. They'll call it an accident. Not if she got to them first. This wasn't about gold anymore. It wasn't even about truth. It was about Theo. and Emma Callahan had nothing left to lose but the people who had already taken everything. The night smelled like salt and rain, the kind of air that carried both endings and beginnings. Emma stood in the half-lit warehouse near the docks, the echo of waves slapping against the pilings beneath her feet. The space had once stored cargo from all over the world. Now it held nothing but dust, broken pallets, and the slow thrum of her own heartbeat. She could hear the click of her shoes on the concrete as she paced, checking her phone again. 10:58 p.m. He would be here soon. Theo's name still glowed on her lock screen, a photo she could barely look at anymore without feeling her lungs tighten. The text that started all this, "Return the cargo or lose him," had been followed by silence. No more demands, no proof of life, just the weight of waiting. But she had given them what they wanted, the illusion of surrender. A set of headlights swept across the bay doors, growing brighter until they died abruptly. Doors opened, slammed shut. Then came the rhythm of expensive shoes on concrete. Arthur Gaines entered like a man who owned everything he touched. His suit looked hand-stitched from arrogance itself, his silver hair slicked perfectly back. Two men flanked him, guards, broad-shouldered, eyes hidden behind mirrored glasses despite the night. "Miss Callahan," Arthur said smoothly, his voice carrying that particular brand of contempt reserved for people who weren't supposed to exist. "You've made quite the mess." Emma forced her voice steady. "I brought what you asked for." She gestured to the briefcase on the table, a decoy loaded with duplicates of her father's data files. The real ones were already safe, encrypted, and duplicated. Arthur smirked, circling the table like a predator humoring his prey. "You think you're the first idealist to come after us? Your father tried the same thing. We offered him an escape, a fortune, in fact. He couldn't take it." His voice dipped, almost fond. "Shame, really. He had integrity. Integrity doesn't spend well." "Where's my son?" Emma asked. He waved a hand dismissively. "Safe for now. Depends on how this goes." He glanced at the briefcase, his tone almost bored. "You have no idea what you're holding, do you? That information could topple economies, start wars." She met his gaze. "Good. Maybe it's time some walls fell." Arthur chuckled, a low sound that made her stomach twist. "You're your father's daughter, all right." He stepped closer. "But unlike him, you'll walk away alive. Hand over the files, and I'll have the boy back to you before sunrise. Cross me, and you'll never find what's left of him." Emma took a slow breath, steadying the tremor in her hands. The camera feed clipped to her jacket was already live, sending every word, every sneer, to Sarah's team waiting in a van 3 blocks away. She'd known Sarah for only weeks, but trust had come fast, the way it does when you're out of options. "You talk a lot about mercy," Emma said softly, "but you've built your empire on silence. I think it's time people heard the truth." Arthur raised an eyebrow, intrigued but still careless. "And who exactly do you think is listening?" She looked straight into his eyes and said, "Everyone." That was the cue. Somewhere outside, Sarah's voice came through Emma's hidden earpiece. One word: now. Within seconds, the world tilted. The hidden feed went live across multiple platforms: social media, streaming sites, news outlets. Screens lit up in living rooms, bars, and offices with Arthur Gaines's voice admitting to crimes that stretched across decades: offshore accounts, environmental bribes, manipulated contracts. He didn't even realize he had damned himself until his phone began to buzz in his pocket, and one of his guards whispered urgently in his ear. Arthur turned to her slowly, realization dawning. "What did you do?" Emma held his gaze. "What you said my father couldn't. I finished it." The guard to his left moved first, reaching under his jacket. Emma saw the motion too late. There was no sound at first, just the flash of movement, the weightless instant before a storm breaks. Then a gunshot cracked the air. Gabriel appeared out of nowhere, bursting through the side door, tackling her hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. The sound came next, another shot, louder this time. The echo rolled through the warehouse like thunder. When she looked up, Gabriel was on the ground, his body twisted, blood blooming through his shirt. The man who'd fired stumbled back as police sirens wailed in the distance. Sarah's final insurance plan. Arthur was shouting orders, his calm veneer shattered, but his words blurred into noise. Emma crawled to Gabriel, her hands already slick with blood. He looked at her, trying to smile, his breath shallow. "Told you not to come alone." "Don't you dare," she whispered, pressing her hand to his wound. "Stay with me." His eyes fluttered, searching hers. "Worth it," he managed, voice breaking. "Your father would have been proud." The warehouse erupted with chaos, flashing lights, shouting officers, the distant wail of approaching news crews, but all Emma could hear was the slow, uneven rhythm of Gabriel's breath, the sound fading under the noise. The world had finally seen the truth, but it had cost her more than she ever imagined. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red as Gabriel's truck tore down the freeway, engines screaming against the weight of his own blood. Emma sat in the passenger seat, one hand clutching the dashboard, the other pressed hard against the wound in his side. Every few seconds she glanced at him, half expecting him to pass out, half terrified he would. His face was pale beneath the smear of oil and sweat, his breath shallow but determined. "Keep pressure on it," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Just drive," she said. Her voice was sharp but trembling. They flew past the empty warehouses and half-lit refineries that lined the outskirts of Houston, the night thick with rain and exhaust. The windshield wipers scraped rhythmically, each pass clearing only a moment's worth of clarity before another wave of mist swallowed the world again. Somewhere behind them, the echoes of sirens faded. Ahead, nothing but shadow. Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket. She fumbled it out, still holding the cloth to Gabriel's wound. It was a message from Sarah. "Check the old refinery on Crane Street. They moved him. East Wing. Hurry!" Her heart stopped. "Theo?" she breathed. Gabriel's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. "You trust her?" "With my life," Emma said. Then, after a beat, with his. The truck fishtailed as they made the turn off the main road, gravel spitting from under the tires. The refinery loomed out of the fog like a skeleton of the past. Rusted pipes, broken tanks, staircases that led nowhere. The gate hung open, swinging in the wind. Gabriel killed the headlights and coasted the last 100 feet. "We don't know who's still here," he said. Emma nodded, hand already reaching for the crowbar wedged beside the seat. "Then we'll find out fast." They moved through the darkness carefully, the sound of dripping water echoing off concrete. The smell of burnt oil and rain mixed in the air, sharp and metallic. Somewhere deeper in the building, she thought she heard movement, a faint scuffle, the sound of something being dragged. Then a voice, small and hoarse. "Mom?" Her chest broke open. "Theo!" He appeared at the edge of the hallway, barefoot, wrapped in an oversized jacket that wasn't his. His eyes were wide, glassy with fear. The moment he saw her, he ran, and she dropped everything to catch him. The force of his little body nearly knocked her to the ground. "It's okay," she whispered, holding him so tightly he squirmed. "I've got you." "I've got you." Gabriel leaned against the wall, breathing hard, his shirt soaked through. He managed a weak smile. "Told you we'd find him." Theo looked up at the older man, eyes flicking to the blood staining his hands. "You're hurt." Gabriel's laugh came out like a cough. "Nothing new." Emma turned to him, her joy bleeding into fear. "We need to get you to a hospital." He shook his head. "Not yet. Cops will be swarming the city after that broadcast. We'll head south, find a safe house. Sarah's got people," but even as he spoke, his knees buckled. Emma lunged forward, catching him as he slid to the floor. His breathing was ragged now, the strength in his voice unraveling. "Stay with me," she said, pressing her hand back over the wound. "You hear me? You don't get to quit now." Gabriel's eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain, but still holding that quiet steadiness she'd come to rely on. "You did it," he whispered. "The truth's out there now. They can't bury it anymore. Emma shook her head, tears streaking down her face. Not without you. He tried to smile. He said you'd finish what he started. The words hit her like a punch. Her father's echo passed from one dying man to another. Don't you dare say goodbye, she whispered fiercely. His grip tightened weakly around her wrist. Not goodbye, he breathed. Just forward. Then his hand went slack. Emma pressed her forehead against his knuckles, shaking. Theo crouched beside her, small hand slipping into hers. The sound of distant sirens began to rise again, faint but growing, mingling with the rhythm of rain hitting the broken roof above. When the paramedics finally arrived, thanks to Sarah's second message, they found Emma sitting beside Gabriel's body, her face streaked with soot and salt. She didn't cry anymore. She just looked at him like she was memorizing the shape of courage. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, she whispered something only he would understand. I'll finish it, I swear. And for a moment, as the red lights flickered against the refinery walls, she thought she heard his voice again, calm, certain, blending with the wind. Forward. By morning, the world was on fire, not with flames this time, but with truth. It began as a ripple, an anonymous live stream posted by Sarah's team at 2:13 a.m. Arthur Gaines, the face of billion-dollar empires, confessing to decades of corruption under the warm glow of warehouse lights. His arrogance had been his undoing. The camera had captured every smirk, every word, every name. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. The morning news ran it between commercials for coffee and car insurance, while online headlines screamed his downfall in all caps. The Callahan tapes, one banner read. The whistleblower's daughter exposes global scandal. Emma watched from the small motel room on the edge of Houston, the TV light flickering against the wallpaper. Theo was asleep beside her, curled under an old blanket. On the screen they played the clip again and again. Arthur Gaines admitting to laundering government funds through offshore oil contracts, laughing about politicians who could be bought cheaper than crude. His voice filled the room like a ghost finally forced into the open. Sarah called just before sunrise. It's everywhere, she said breathlessly. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, the whole damn world's watching. Emma didn't know what to say. She looked at Theo, his chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. He'd hate this, she said quietly. My father. He never wanted attention, just the truth. Then he got what he wanted, Sarah replied. There was a pause. But Emma, you need to be careful. They're already spinning it. Half the corporations named in the files are claiming forgery, and Gaines's lawyers are saying the footage was digitally manipulated. They'll drag you through hell before they admit it's real. I know, Emma said, rubbing her eyes. Let them. By noon, the motel parking lot was full. News vans lined the street, their antennas pointed skyward like bayonets. Strangers with microphones and cameras shouted questions every time Emma tried to step outside. How long have you known about the evidence? Did your father work alone? Were you involved in the fire at the docks? She didn't answer any of them. The only place she went was back to the Mirabelle. When she reached the shipyard that afternoon, she froze. Dozens of people stood gathered along the chain-link fence. Locals, reporters, students, veterans. Some held signs that read, Truth floats, justice for Callahan, let the light in. The Mirabelle loomed behind them, her rusted hull streaked with ash and history. The fire damage still scarred her metal bones, but somehow she looked alive again, reborn. A reporter caught sight of Emma and pointed. There she is. Microphones rose like a tide. Questions flew faster than she could process them. Ms. Callahan, is it true your father died protecting this data? What will you do with the gold? Do you have anything to say to the victims of the cover-up? She wanted to scream. She wanted to disappear. But then she saw Theo standing a few steps behind her, clutching the sketchbook he'd drawn ships in since he was 5. He was watching her, not scared, not uncertain, just proud, waiting. Emma straightened. My father didn't die for money, she said, her voice calm but carrying. He died believing truth still matters. The Mirabelle wasn't just a ship, it was his conscience. And if it means anything to you, to any of us, then maybe it's time we remember what it cost to stay quiet. The crowd went still. Cameras rolled. For the first time since this began, she felt like she was no longer speaking for him, but with him. That night, the news called it the broadcast that shook the nation. Hashtags trended. Politicians scrambled. A dozen CEOs resigned before sunrise, and half a dozen investigations opened before noon. The gold her father had hidden, once leverage, was now a legal question, frozen under protection until the courts decided what to do with it. But the Mirabelle didn't belong to the courts anymore. It belonged to everyone. People began leaving flowers by the dock gate, notes, even folded flags. One man laid down a rusted wrench, whispering, "For him." Sarah called again, her voice soft this time. "You realize they've already started calling it the ghost vessel that carried justice?" Emma smiled faintly, watching the ship's dark outline against the horizon. "Good," she said. "Then maybe ghosts can finally rest." Out on the deck, the wind caught the edge of a loose tarp, snapping it like a salute. The world had seen the truth at last. But beneath the glow of victory, Emma knew this wasn't an ending. It was only the tide turning. The lawyer's office smelled of paper and rain, the kind of place where time didn't move so much as sigh. Emma sat in a leather chair too big for her, hands folded tight in her lap, watching a drop of water roll slowly down the window pane. Outside, Houston was gray and quiet, still reeling from the storm of headlines that had consumed it. The whole country was. But here, in this small office tucked away from the chaos, the world felt smaller, personal, almost fragile. Across the desk, Mr. Llewellyn adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. He was an old man with a voice that sounded like rusted hinges, the kind of man who had probably seen more secrets than truth in his line of work. "Miss Callahan," he said gently, "thank you for coming on such short notice. Your father's will was locked under court seal until the investigation concluded. Now that the matter is public, we've been granted permission to release its contents." Emma nodded, unable to find her voice. Theo sat beside her, swinging his legs quietly, a sketchbook open on his knees. He was drawing the Mirabelle again, this time brighter, almost golden. The thought made her throat ache. Mr. Llewellyn placed a thin folder on the desk, the seal already broken. "Your father wasn't a man of many words in legal documents," he said. "But this one, well, it's different." He left instructions, personal ones. He slid a single handwritten page toward her. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable, looping, careful, certain. "Emma," it began, "if you're reading this, it means the truth is finally free. I'm sorry for the years you had to live without knowing why. The gold is not a curse, it's a bridge. Use it to rebuild what they destroyed. Not for me, not for vengeance, but for others who still believe in second chances." Emma's breath caught. Her eyes traced every letter, every small imperfection in the handwriting she'd memorized as a child. Beneath the paragraph, a final line waited, like a whisper from beyond. "And when you meet Gabriel again, tell him I kept my promise." She blinked, reading it again. "What does that mean?" Mr. Llewellyn folded his hands, his expression unreadable. "There's more," he said. "A sealed note addressed to you personally." He handed her a smaller envelope, brittle and yellow around the edges. She opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph, her father standing beside a younger Gabriel, both in uniform, the sea behind them. The handwriting on the back read, "He's more than you think." Mr. Llewellyn spoke softly. "Your father and Mr. Knox served together, Intelligence Division. After your mother's death, your father went into hiding, but he made one final request to his old network, that Gabriel watch over you and your son should anything happen." The world tilted. The air felt thin. "He wasn't just a mechanic," she whispered. "No," the lawyer said. He was your father's closest friend, and by all accounts, his last. Bound by oath, not salary. Emma pressed the photograph against her chest, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. She thought of Gabriel's steady calm, his cryptic warnings, the way he had seemed to know her father's thoughts without ever speaking them. All those quiet moments on the ship where he had looked at her not like a stranger, but like someone carrying the weight of a promise. Tears blurred her vision. "He never told me," she said softly. "Because it wasn't his to tell," Mr. Llewellyn replied. "Your father wanted you to find your own strength before you learned how carefully he'd tried to protect you. He didn't abandon you, Miss Callahan. He prepared you." Emma nodded, but she couldn't speak. Theo reached over and slipped his hand into hers, grounding her. "Mom," he said gently, "Grandpa didn't leave us alone." "No," she said, her voice trembling. "He never did." Outside, the rain began again, soft, cleansing, persistent. Emma stared down at her father's words, the ink glistening faintly under the light. "The gold is not a curse, it's a bridge." She thought of the Mirabelle, the ship that refused to die, and of Gabriel's last words, "Forward." For the first time since everything began, she didn't feel haunted by what her father left behind. She felt guided. He hadn't vanished into the dark to escape the world. He'd gone ahead to make sure she would one day find her way through it. Spring arrived slow that year, as if even the weather needed time to heal. The Gulf shimmered under a softer kind of sun, and the air carried the faint scent of salt and paint, a smell Emma had come to love. The shipyard no longer felt haunted. Workers moved along the docks with purpose, sanding, welding, laughing. The Mirabelle, once a wounded relic of secrecy, now gleamed with life. Her hull had been stripped and repainted a deep ocean blue, her brass polished until it caught the morning light like a mirror. Emma stood on the dock, hands in her pockets, watching a team hoist a new sign onto the deck's entryway. The letters, freshly carved, read, "The Callahan Maritime Trust." The name still caught in her throat every time she saw it, equal parts pride and ache. It had taken months of legal battles, late nights, and quiet determination, but she'd done it, used a fraction of the recovered gold, as her father asked, not for power, not for revenge, but for rebuilding. The Trust's purpose was simple, honest: scholarships for coastal workers' children, funds for cleanup efforts along the Gulf, research grants for sustainable fishing. It was everything her father had loved: the ocean, the people who lived by it, the future it could still hold if someone cared enough to fight for it. Theo was the first to notice the tourists. They came quietly at first, small groups led by volunteers who spoke in soft, reverent tones, as though walking through a church. Word had spread about the ship that exposed a trillion-dollar scandal, about the woman who turned pain into purpose. The Mirabelle had become something larger than a symbol. She was a living reminder of what truth could survive. "Mom," Theo said, tugging on her sleeve, "they're here again." She smiled. "Then let's make sure she's ready." They boarded together, the sound of their footsteps echoing lightly across the freshly restored deck. The air was warm, tinged with varnish and sea breeze. Everywhere Emma looked, life had replaced decay. New rigging, cleaned rails, plaques marking the ship's history. One read, "Burned but not broken, restored in honor of truth." Another, "Dedicated to those who risked everything to bring light where darkness had roots." When the tour reached the captain's quarters, the visitors fell quiet. The room had been restored down to the smallest detail. Maps on the wall, instruments polished, the desk cleared except for one thing: a glass case resting at its center. Inside, illuminated by a gentle spotlight, was her father's old logbook. Its leather cover was cracked, its pages yellowed, but the pen marks inside were still bold, steady. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Sometimes the treasure isn't gold. It's the courage to open what others locked." Emma had written the words herself. She stood off to the side as the visitors lingered, their expressions shifting between curiosity and quiet awe. She could tell who had come for spectacle and who had come for understanding. Some stared at the logbook as though expecting it to whisper. Others traced the words on the plaque with their fingers. A woman in her 60s, with salt-streaked hair and tired eyes, looked up at Emma as she passed. "Your father was a brave man," she said softly, "but so are you." Emma didn't know how to answer that, so she just nodded. Later, when the last tour had ended and the sun dipped below the horizon, she sat alone in the captain's room. The ship creaked gently around her, the sound familiar and comforting. Through the window, the water shimmered in streaks of bronze. She could almost see her father's reflection beside hers, the same quiet pride in his eyes. Theo's laughter carried faintly from the deck outside, where he chased a stray gull that had decided to make the ship its home. His joy sounded like everything her father had wanted to protect. Emma reached out and rested her hand on the glass case. "You did it," she whispered. "You built the bridge." The Mirabelle groaned softly as if answering. Outside, the last light of day caught the polished hull, setting it ablaze in gold. And for the first time in years, Emma didn't see loss when she looked at the sea. She saw legacy, built not from fortune, but from courage. The kind that lasts longer than gold and shines brighter than fire. The horizon burned gold and rose that evening, the gulf calm enough to look like molten glass. Emma stood at the rail of the Mirabelle, her fingers resting lightly on the cool steel as the wind curled her hair around her face. The day had been long, meetings, donors, foundation calls, but this, the quiet before dusk, was what she waited for. It was the only part of the day that still felt like hers. Behind her came the familiar rhythm of small footsteps and a boy's laugh. Theo tore across the deck, nearly tripping over a coil of rope, his voice bright and uncontained. "Uncle Gabe!" he shouted. Emma turned just in time to see Gabriel Knox step onto the deck, his limp faint but not gone. He looked different. Leaner, his skin still pale from weeks in recovery, but the same steady warmth lived in his eyes. Theo collided with him, wrapping his arms tight around his waist. Gabriel laughed softly and crouched to hug him back, wincing only slightly. "Easy, sailor," he said. "Doctor says no wrestling yet." Theo grinned. "Mom says that too." "Well," Gabriel said, straightening, "you'd better listen to her." "She's smarter than both of us." Emma smiled. "That's the first time I've heard you admit that." "Don't get used to it." His voice was teasing, but when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. Relief, gratitude, something deeper, neither needed to name. They walked together toward the bow, the sound of waves soft against the hull. The sunset painted the water in streaks of copper and fire. Gabriel rested his hands on the railing, his fingers brushing the smooth metal where rust had once lived. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. Emma followed his gaze. "She's finally home. I remember when she was a ghost," he said, "and so were you." Emma exhaled, a small laugh breaking through her chest. "You're not wrong. I used to think ghosts were what haunted you. Turns out, they're just the things you refuse to face." He nodded, watching the horizon. "And now? I faced them." Her voice softened. "I never wanted revenge, Gabriel. I thought I did at first, but I think what I really wanted was understanding. I spent half my life angry at a man I thought abandoned me, when all he did was trust me to finish what he couldn't." Gabriel said nothing for a moment. The sea breeze tugged at his jacket, and the last of the sunlight caught the edge of his face. "He didn't die with secrets," Emma continued. "He died with faith. Faith that one day I'd be brave enough to listen." Gabriel turned to her, his expression gentle. "You did more than listen, Emma. You turned the tide." The words settled between them, simple and true. Emma felt something loosen inside her, something that had been wound tight for years. For the first time since her father's death, she didn't feel like she was chasing answers. She had become one. Theo came running up beside them, a sketchbook tucked under his arm. "Look, Uva," he said, flipping it open. On the page, in bright, careful strokes, he'd drawn the Mirabelle, as she looked now, shining, strong, her name written proudly across the bow. Behind her, the horizon stretched endless and alive. "Do you like it?" Emma brushed a hand through his hair. "It's perfect." Theo looked out at the water. "Grandpa would have liked it too." "He would have loved it," Gabriel said, his voice low but sure. The boy smiled and ran off again, chasing the fading sun. Emma watched him go, the wind catching the corners of his sketchbook as he held it high like a flag. When she turned back to Gabriel, the light had softened to amber, the kind that made everything feel like memory, even as it was happening. "You know," she said, "for a long time I thought this story ended with him. Now I see it never did. I just had to claim my part in it." Gabriel smiled faintly. "You belong to it now. All of it, the pain, the truth, the beauty. It's yours." Emma looked out over the water, the reflection of the sky dancing across the waves. She felt peace then, not the fragile kind that disappears when the world turns loud again, but the deep, quiet kind that stays. Not from wealth or victory, but from something simpler, belonging. The sun slipped under the horizon, leaving a trail of light that shimmered like promise. Emma closed her eyes, breathing in the salt air, and whispered, "We're home." The water was clear that morning, glassy and calm, the kind of rare stillness that felt like the ocean holding its breath. The Mirabelle floated in perfect equilibrium, her newly painted hull gleaming beneath the sun. 1 year had passed since her restoration, since the world had learned her story, and yet she still seemed to hum with secrets. Emma stood on the dock, the wind tugging gently at her hair, as she watched the maintenance crew prepare for the dive. It was routine, just another inspection of the hull to make sure the old ship's bones stayed strong. But something about the day felt different. The air carried that strange quiet she'd learned to recognize, the kind that comes just before discovery. Theo sat cross-legged on deck, sketching the waterline with his ever-present pencil. He'd grown taller this past year, his face leaner, his curiosity sharper. Every so often, he'd glance up from his drawing to watch the divers disappear below the surface, bubbles rising like ghosts to mark where they'd gone. Emma smiled at him, that familiar warmth blooming in her chest. The world had changed, but in this small, steady way, it had stayed good. Half an hour into the dive, one of the crew members surfaced, gasping slightly as he pushed his mask onto his forehead. "Ms. Callahan," he shouted, voice echoing across the dock, "you need to see this." Emma's pulse quickened. She stepped forward as the diver pulled himself up onto the ladder, one hand gripping a small object encrusted with years of salt and rust. It was cylindrical, no longer than her forearm, sealed tight with a corroded cap. He set it gently in her hands. "Found it wedged between the hull plates," he said. "Could have been there for decades. Thought it might belong to you." Emma turned it over carefully, her fingers tracing the rough surface. Through the grime, she saw a faint engraving, her father's initials. Her throat tightened. "It does," she whispered. Back in the captain's quarters, she cleaned the capsule slowly, afraid that hurrying might break the spell. The metal groaned as she twisted the cap loose, and for a moment she hesitated. Then the seal gave way with a soft hiss, releasing a breath of trapped air that smelled faintly of salt and oil. Inside, wrapped in waterproof paper, was a small recorder. Her hands shook as she pressed play. A burst of static filled the room, followed by a familiar sound, the low, steady voice she hadn't heard in years. "If you're hearing this, Emma," her father said, his tone gentle, aged, unwavering, "then you found what matters. Not the gold, not the proof, but the reason." Emma sank into the nearest chair, tears already blurring the edges of her vision. The recording crackled again, his voice fading in and out like the tide. "The sea hides everything it loves," he continued, "until someone brave enough dives deep enough to find it." She could hear him breathe at the end, could almost see him sitting somewhere far away, recording these words with the quiet certainty that she would one day listen. The static returned, louder now, before the message clicked off and left only silence. Emma sat there for a long time, the weight of it pressing against her chest. He hadn't left her clues for fortune. He'd left her proof of faith, that he believed in her long before she ever believed in herself. When she stepped back out onto the deck, the sunlight caught her face, warm and forgiving. The ocean stretched endless before her, glittering like 1,000 small miracles. Theo spotted her and stood, waving. "Mom," he called to her, his voice bright. "Come see, look what I drew." She raised a hand in return, smiling through the ache that wasn't sadness anymore, just gratitude. "Coming, sweetheart." Her gaze drifted once more to the water, to the ripples glinting under the afternoon light. "I finally did, Dad," she whispered. The sea said nothing, but its rhythm seemed to change, waves folding gently against the hull, sunlight flickering across the surface like a pulse. It wasn't sound exactly, but Emma felt it all the same. A conversation carried without words, applause without noise, the language of endings that weren't really endings at all. The Mirabelle rocked lightly beneath her feet, alive again, and the world kept moving forward, steady, vast, and full of hidden things waiting to be found. If this story moved you, even just a little, take a breath and share your thoughts below. Tell me where in the world you're reading from, and what part of Emma's journey stayed with you most. And if you believe that truth, courage, and love still have the power to change everything, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story will take you somewhere unforgettable.